This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
Third thing is that the Spirit of God, by the way, the reason this spoke so diligently to Nicodemus was they thought they could control God by doing all of these certain things. That if they followed these laws and they did all of these things, then God would be obliged to do certain things. And what Jesus was saying was, look, just because you do all of those things, follow all those rules and regulations that you've set up, doesn't mean that God's going to be obliged to you. The third thing is that the Spirit of God has a plan that man cannot explain. You can't explain. You can't explain where the wind is coming from or where it's going. You can't do it. And in the same way with God, you can't explain where God's coming from or where He's going. You look at your life today and tell me that you thought this is where you'd be 20 years ago. Now, tell me where you're going to be 20 years from now. You see, when God and I can tell where some of you are going to be 20 years from now, but that probably shouldn't. The purpose of this, of what Jesus is saying here is, look, God has a plan. He knows where He's coming from and He knows where He's going. And you're either in on it or you're not. And you don't control Him. You're not telling God where He can go and what He has to do. You're either in on it or you're not. And then He wraps it up with this statement in this verse. He says, those who are born of the Spirit of God must be prepared to live accordingly. If you are born by the Spirit of God, then you better be prepared to live accordingly. I'm so amazed at Christians who aren't prepared to live according to the Spirit of God. They just want to live the way they were living before, only better. I want to have less problems, so I became a Christian. Hell, did you come to the wrong party? I'm going to become a Christian because because the people are nicer. Maybe in the Methodist church, but not in this, not in Baptist churches. Some Baptist churches. Oh man, I better not say that. I gave my address out earlier. But the fact of the matter is, we have this idea that we have this preconceived notion of what the Christian life is all about. And some of it comes from the things that we're taught as we're growing up. Some of it's taught from some books that we've read, or preachers have said certain things about it. And so we start believing these things, and then we miss out on what it is that God has for us. The bottom line is this: if you are born of the Spirit of God, then you have to be prepared to live accordingly. And that means three things. Number one, God will move by His desires. Be open. God is going to move according to His own desires, not yours. So be open. Be ready. When God decides that He wants to do something, be open to it. Be open to it. That is one of the most frightening things for Christians. It's tough for us to be open to something that we don't know. I remember as a boy when I'd go to my grandfather's house, he had this cellar, and he lived down in close to the Boot Heel of Missouri, and he had the cellar underneath the house, and it was just this dark. You go down these steps, and it was dark, and it would get dank, and it would get cooler as you got further down, and there was this big creaky door, and you open the door, and you'd look in, and it was dark in there, and I'd be so freaked out about that. I just didn't want to go into that because I didn't know what was there. My grandfather, on the other hand, he'd walk down there without even looking where he was going. He'd open the door, fling in there, go in there. Found out later he had cherry wine in there, which is probably one of the reasons he went in there. But I was afraid of something that I knew was okay, but I just didn't want to do it. until my grandfather was down there. Then it was okay. If he was down there, then I knew it was okay. Same thing is true. I saw the same thing happen with our little granddaughter, Mona Jane. One day, she went upstairs. Somehow or other, she got upstairs. This was a few years ago. She was just learning to walk and getting around on her own. And she knew that where Grandpa's studio was, that Grandpa spent a lot of time up in the studio working, and that anytime that she wanted to, she could walk into the studio and sit on Grandpa's lap, and we'd watch children's songs on YouTube, and it was great. Anytime. She controlled me. She knew that. Well, one day, she went up there, and I wasn't up there, and she went up there, and it was dark, and she totally freaked out. She was just, she just panicked because it was dark, and I wasn't there, and she just started crying, and, she was just really upset and everything, and I said, Mona, what's wrong? And I ran up the steps. I didn't know if she was hurt or whatever there was. As soon as she saw me there, she was fine. Everything was fine. Then she just walked right into the room, walked right into my little booth, which is really dark, and she was fine, totally fine with it, because she knew I was there. Now, we're the same way with God. If we know that God is in the darkness, we'll go into it. The problem is that some of us don't think He's there. And we start doing things that we're not ready to do, or we try to do things that we're not prepared to do because we're not connected with God. We don't know if He's there or not. But the fact of the matter is, if God is in it, then we have to be there. So what you have to do as a child of God is determine where God is and go there. Easier said than done, perhaps. But the problem is many of us get it all backwards. We go somewhere looking for God, hoping that He's there, not knowing if He's there or not. You have to know if God's in it or not. Years ago, when I was doing youth ministry, I was down in Florida, and I really felt like God had told me to do this, to do a survey of young people in the high school. And I was told, I said, okay, but, when I would go to people and I'd say, how am I going to do a survey? How am I going to survey all the high school students? They said, well, you can't. Well, why? Well, because there's privacy laws, and you just can't. You can't have access to all of those students. You can't get all of that information. I said, but I had 3 or 4 questions that I wanted to ask them. The final question is, what is your purpose in life? And so there weren't, they didn't even have to put their name on it. I just wanted to know what their answers were for this little project that I was doing. And they said, no, you can't do it. You can't do that. But I knew that God had said, do it. And I didn't know how, what do I do now? So I said, Lord, what do I do? And He said, when I open the door, you walk through it. And I said, okay, so I just wait. And God said, duh. Sort of, something like that. And because that's how He has to talk to me. I'm just a little slow sometimes. It's like, why are you trying to walk through the door that I haven't opened yet? Oh, yeah. Okay. So I waited. I waited exactly 1 week. And I was in my office one day, and some of my high school students walked in, from my youth group, walked in, and they said, hey, Dan. And I said, what? And they said, we got this idea. We'd like to do a survey of all the high school students in our high school. Now, don't tell me that God didn't open that door. And I said, well, how are you going to do that? And they said, well, we're with them all day long. We can just ask them questions. And I said, what do you mean, like in the hallway? And they said, yeah. How else would we do it? And I went, okay. What do you want to know? And they said, I don't know. Do you have any ideas? Do you see what I'm talking about? God opens the doors when God's ready to open the doors. We do a great disservice when we think, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do. Now we go trying to bust down a door. You know what the best thing you can do sometimes? Shut up and sit still. Just stop and let God be God. Let him do what he's going to do. If he's given you the motivation, Psalm 37:4, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will put his desires in your heart, which is what that verse says. If you believe that, then let God put his desires in your heart, and then let him open the doors as he's ready to open the doors. I mean, what could be simpler than that? God will move by his desires. Be open.